Hey guys, welcome to Self-Inflicted Recovery, Redemption, and Life. This is your host, Louis Vandelay. So, I've been clean for a little over 4 years. I used for about 17 years very heavily, mostly marijuana and alcohol. There were a few years there where I also had a serious problem with coke. During those 17 years, I did a lot of damage to my life and I caused a lot of emotional pain, both for myself as well as for my loved ones. And getting clean was pretty damn hard. But it was also super rewarding in the sense that it lifted the fog of misery, and it also allowed me to be a more complete human being. The purpose of this podcast is to help people who are teetering on the edge of making a decision to make an effort to get sober, or perhaps to help people who have achieved their sobriety to keep their sobriety by staying on the path. You fought so hard for it, now maintain it and make sure you keep it. Or maybe it'll help the normies to understand something that is incomprehensible to them. And by that, I mean our behavior. Now, this episode deals with the question, how do you know when you have a problem? And it explores my own internal investigative process around answering that question. If you're unsure you have a problem, hopefully this episode helps you to arrive at whatever the correct conclusion is for yourself. If you find this helpful, share it with others. If you're listening via iTunes, please scroll down to the ratings and review section, leave me a rating and review. YouTube, like, subscribe, comment, all that. If you have thoughts, comments, or feedback for me, I can be reached via email at selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. Now, I've made an effort here not to repeat too much from previous episodes, but all of this is interrelated. And if you want to hear more about my story, that's covered in episodes 1 and 2. But in the beginning of my use, things were fun, and it was somewhat optional. Meaning that early on, before my addiction had progressed very far, I had the ability to stop for a month or two if I needed to. As things progressed though, drinking and doing drugs, they became something that I had to do, not something that I wanted to do, or I got to do. As time moved on, and I was consumed by my addiction more and more, as I lost control, I knew in the back of my mind that my behavior was damaging and dangerous. But I wasn't quite motivated enough to stop it. As time went on, things would blow up in my face, and they were the direct result of my addictive tendencies. When I say blow up in my face, I mean I would suffer consequences. Some examples of this would be failed relationships with girlfriends, losing jobs, losing job opportunities, getting arrested, losing friendships, almost dying, putting myself at risk of incarceration. All these things happen to me. I've seen other people who, they get wrapped up in the law, DUIs, DWIs. Maybe they got wasted at the company party and made fools of themselves, cheated on their significant others. You get the idea. And when I would suffer consequences, it would cause me to question my choice to continue living in this fashion. And I think that is one of the key ways we can tell when and if we have a problem. If we've suffered consequences from using in the past, and we know that continued use will lead to more consequences, which are painful, our desire to use, though, it's so overwhelming that we do it anyway, knowing full well that we'll pay the price for it. We're unable to stay sober even though we know using will result in pain. I think that is when it's a problem, So I think it comes down to this question. Who's in charge? Am I in charge? Or is my addiction in charge? For me, if I'm in charge, then the activity may be something I enjoy doing. But for me, it was addiction that was in charge time and time again, as evidenced by the fact that I'd suffered negative consequences repeatedly as a result of my behavior, yet I still continue to do it. I've read that scientists have success inducing addiction in mice in laboratories, and they do this in an effort to study addiction and how it works in the brain. Anyway, once it's induced or created by providing a substance to the mouse or the rat repeatedly, the mouse will then put itself in very risky situations to obtain their drug of choice. For example, the mouse or the rat would be willing to go into a room that smells like cats, or would be willing to go into a room where cats can be heard meowing if it means getting their drug of choice. This illustrates the notion that once addicted, we'll take risks to use and obtain our drug of choice, even if there's a high probability of suffering major consequence. For example, losing our lives to overdose, going to prison, being jailed, losing families, all that kind of thing. So sometimes, after I suffered these consequences, what would happen is I would try to make a change. I'd try to quit. Maybe cold turkey, maybe like a graduated step-down type of approach where I slowly try to reduce my use. It usually depended on how traumatic the recent consequence was. Then one of a couple of things would happen. Scenario one is I would manage to not use for maybe a few days or a week or something, and then I would start to think, oh, maybe I'm normal. Maybe I don't have a problem, and I can use drugs or alcohol like a normal person, meaning I can use them in moderation. And then I would use this rationalization process to start using again, and I'd feed myself some bullshit line about only smoking or drinking on the weekends or after work, or not in the morning or at lunch or after 7 p.m. or whatever. And then I would pursue that strategy, the strategy of moderation, and then I would slowly abandon it until I was back to using all day, every day. And I think that voice saying, oh, maybe I'm normal, maybe I don't have a problem, that's the addictive voice. It's always trying to wrap you back up in it. Scenario 2 was this. I would stop using cold turkey, and I'd only make it for like 30 minutes or an hour, or a day or two, and then I would decide that I couldn't do it. And I'd abandon the effort almost immediately, and go back to using the way that I did before. So, after I suffered the consequence, I was forced to acknowledge the little voice inside of me that said, you can't keep living like this. And then I would try to get and stay sober. Whether it was scenario 1 or scenario 2, I would fail miserably. And then I would just decide I couldn't do it. It's too hard. It's impossible. And because of my bitter defeat at the hands of addiction, I would settle for going back to the way things were. I would ignore the voice telling me, you can't keep living like this and you deserve more. And I would go back to using. And as I would fail miserably and relapse, sometimes after 5 minutes, sometimes a half an hour, a day, a week, whatever, I would rationalize continuing to live with my addiction. Part of that was pure discouragement and disbelief based on my continued, total failures. And another part of it was my addictive voice, and it was saying, like I said, you're functional, you work hard and make good money, blah, blah, blah. Maybe you don't have a problem, or maybe you can or should continue to live this way since it feels good and getting sober is hopeless. So I would vacillate between a desire to quit and giving up and resigning myself to continuing to live with feeding my addiction due to hopelessness. But as I reflect on this, sometimes that voice, part of that internal rationalization process, actually had me believing that the way I was living was okay, and maybe I could live like this indefinitely. After all, I had money, I had a job, and a handful of people in my life who cared about me and loved me. This was a sort of coping and rationalization mechanism. I use the word coping because I felt hopeless due to my inability to control my addiction, and the way that I would cope with that hopelessness was to act like I was okay with the way things were, when really deep down I wasn't okay. And I use the word rationalization because my brain was doing all sorts of, mental gymnastics to allow and encourage my addiction to continue. Looking back, I realize now that I needed as much help and as many voices hitting me from different directions as possible to bring my attention and convince me of the fact that I was hopelessly addicted, and that it couldn't go on. So finally, what convinced me to get professional help and treatment was 2 therapists and a psychiatrist, all telling me in a 7-day period I needed help. So I started an IOP program, intensive outpatient, and part of that process was to figure out a program that I could work when I got out of IOP. Go to a bunch of different meetings, figure out what fits in with you, what works. The idea was that when I completed IOP, I would be left with a program to work to help me stay sober. So I was in IOP for 5 or 6 weeks. I tried a bunch of different kinds of meetings. I went to Smart Recovery, I went to Alcoholics Anonymous, Marijuana Anonymous. I even tried Celebrate Recovery once. I ended up going to AA and MA as part of my sobriety maintenance program. And when I went to these meetings, they had a bunch of pamphlets. And both meetings had a pamphlet that had a bunch of questions on them. And the idea was if you could answer yes to, X number of questions, it meant that there was a really, really good chance that you had a problem. and that you probably belonged in the group. And I remember reading these questions and thinking, geez, this is amazing. I'm not alone. I'm a dead ringer for these questions. And I could tell that whoever the hell came up with them, they were exactly like me. And I wasn't alone. And I also remember thinking, wow, if I'd read something like this years ago, it may have been one more straw on the camel's back, and it could have pushed me over the edge to decide to get sober. And maybe I would have given this a shot sooner. So I'm going to go ahead and review a set of questions from MA and AA, since my primary drugs of choice for the last 10 to 12 years of my addiction were marijuana and alcohol. First, we'll go through the marijuana questions. I'll read the question, and then I'll give my answer and elaborate on it. Number 1. Has smoking marijuana stopped being fun? Yeah, so I used for about 17 years, and it stopped being fun after about 5 to 7 years. The last 10 years, it was a lot of work. It was fun at times, but mostly I was tired of it, and I only continued doing it because I needed to feel okay. Not happy, but okay. And I even recall in the last 5 or 10 years, sometimes I would get frustrated that I had to, take time to do this before I went to work, or worry about how am I going to do this while I'm on vacation? How am I going to either get marijuana at the new place that I go to, or how am I going to transport it from point A to point B without getting in trouble? And I remember being resentful of it, Number 2, do you ever smoke marijuana alone? Always, very frequently. And it wasn't really a social thing. I used to hate going to parties and smoking with large groups because I couldn't get high enough, and I resented sharing my weed with other people who didn't need it. I was okay with smoking with small groups, but I limited my friendships to people who I knew could reciprocate to a certain extent. Number 3, is it hard for you to imagine life without marijuana? Yeah, it was. So, I'm a big fan of zombie movies. I find it an interesting what-if scenario. And I used to worry what would happen when the zombies attacked, because I knew that I needed weed and alcohol to function. I knew that I was dependent on it. And if we or I was having to fight zombies or post-apocalyptic biker gangs while keeping my family safe, I'd be in deep shit, because I'd be struggling with physical and emotional withdrawals at the same time. And plus, if nowhere is safe because civilization has collapsed, getting blackout drunk is kind of a dumb move. And this is also reflected in the lengths I would go to make sure that I had weed on vacations. Number 4, do you find that your friends are determined by your marijuana use? Absolutely. I pretty much only hung out with other people who used. There were a handful of reasons for that, birds of a feather and all that. If I was friends with others who smoked, we could share weed, we could share contacts for acquiring weed, and if I ran out, I could leverage them or their connections to get more. And also, if I surrounded myself with people like me, it would help me to rationalize that my behavior was okay, because I wasn't the only one doing it. Number 5. Do you smoke marijuana to avoid dealing with your problems? For sure. I talk about this at length in several episodes. I would smoke to avoid problems and the negative emotions that come along with problems. Unfortunately, me smoking and quashing those negative emotions wouldn't help me to actually solve those problems. So when I get sober, they were still there waiting for me. Number 6. Do you smoke marijuana to cope with your feelings? Absolutely. So, we just talked about this in the last question. Problems cause negative emotions. For me, negative emotions were dealt with by erasing them by numbing myself with weed and alcohol. Number 7. Does your marijuana use let you live in a privately defined world? Sure. If I was high, it made it easier to believe my own bullshit. It made it easier to deny reality and rationalize all types of terrible behavior. Number 8. Have you ever failed to keep promises that you made about cutting down or controlling your marijuana use? Yeah, for sure. When I was younger, this used to happen with women. We'd be in a relationship and they'd express concern that I was always in an altered state. And I would try to, change my behavior and fail. And it was responsible for the demise of every relationship before my wife and I started dating. So, they'd ask me to cut down, and they would say something like, if you love me, you'd quit or cut down. And then I would tell her I love her, and try to quit and fail miserably and try to hide it. And then when I get caught, things would go to hell in a handbasket. A similar scenario repeated itself with friends, family, parents. So, yeah. Number 9. Has your use of marijuana caused problems with memory, concentration, or motivation? Yeah, absolutely. I talk about it in episode 6, where I discussed things that I'm now free of. For me, it was memory. I had to change my work habits to cope with it. I took lots of notes. I would make a second to-do list for the afternoon before I went to lunch, because when I went on lunch, I would drink and smoke, and I'd forget what happened in the morning and what needed to be done in the afternoon. Also, my motivation was inconsistent because I would lose it right when I smoked. So, number 10. When you're almost out of marijuana, do you feel anxious or worried about how to get more? For sure. I'd actually re-up 2, 3, even 4 days before running out. And I'd also have multiple people that I could get weed from at a given time, in case one of my connections ran dry. Number 11. Do you plan your life around smoking marijuana? Are you kidding me? Everything from when I woke up to what I kept in the car, how my home was built, where I went to lunch, who I went to lunch with, the routes I drove, who I was friends with, everything revolved around it. Number 12. Have your friends or relatives ever complained that your marijuana use is damaging your relationship with them? No, not really. I'm pretty hard-headed. My friends would just leave. They would distance themselves until the relationship was dead. And they had every right to, because I lived a dangerous lifestyle for a while there. I'm a pretty assertive guy, and while I wouldn't get angry with friends, I can see how they wouldn't be eager to engage in that type of conversation with me. My family wasn't really open about it. We didn't talk about real things, but I knew that my behavior was damaging our relationship. In fact, I would isolate from them because I didn't want to be held accountable by those I loved. Nor did I want to exhibit my shameful behavior to them, because I knew it was wrong and they knew it was wrong, but I kept doing it. So I didn't read these questions until I had attended my first MA meeting, which was 3 weeks or maybe a month in my sobriety. But when I read them, I was shocked. Prior to this, I kind of thought that I was one of a kind. And what I mean is prior to the whole, go to IOP, get involved in the recovery community. So I thought I was one of a kind. I thought I was completely alone. And that all sounds ridiculous now. They also have a book at MA called Life with Hope. And it was the same thing with that book. The first half deals with 12 steps and step work. And the second half is stories from other people addicted to marijuana. And the stories also they shook me to my core. I could have written any of those stories myself. They were pretty much all about me. Alright, so now we'll go on to the alcohol questions. And alcohol was also a big part of what I had going on from an addictive perspective. Number 1, do you drink because you have problems to face up to stressful situations? So I've already talked about that in this episode. Yes, I drank more to escape negative feelings, which included stress. Number 2, do you drink when you get mad at other people? Absolutely. I would drink to anesthetize myself from negative emotions, including anger. It was almost like regulating emotions, except I would just shut them off by getting high rather than actually coping with them. Do you prefer to drink alone rather than with others? Yeah, for sure. I'd be happy to get started with others. I'd have 2 or 3 drinks. Eventually, I would want to be alone so I could just drink and drink and drink and drink and not feel guilty. Because when other people see how much I drink, they realize I have a problem. Also, I didn't want to be around others because I would get so trashed, and I wanted to get so trashed that coherent interaction wasn't possible beyond a certain point. So why burden myself with the responsibility of having other people around to communicate with when I could just get trashed by myself if I was all alone? Number 4, are you starting to get low marks? Is your performance at work suffering? Personally, I never got to a point where it interfered too much with my work, but that was only because I put in place special rules and processes and procedures to avoid that issue. Basically, I constructed my life around my addiction to accommodate it. Also, the last couple of years, I would start drinking at lunch. That was my disease progressing, and eventually it would have gotten to a point where it would have interfered with my work, no doubt. Do you ever try to stop or drink less and fail? Yes. Even if I started out trying to have just a few drinks, I would keep drinking until I was completely wasted. Basically, once I got started, there was no self-control. If you go to meetings and all that, some people will say that one's not enough, or I'm sorry, one is too many, and 1,000 is not enough. Number 6, have you begun to drink in the morning before school or work? On special occasion, I would drink in the morning, usually only when we were camping. Before school or work, I never did that, but I think the reason this was never my thing was because I would smoke weed in the morning. That was how I kind of prepped for my day, and it was kind of the balance, right? If I smoked a ton of weed, I could still go and do my job, but I was still high. So I suspect that if I didn't smoke so much weed, that probably would have happened. So that was my first thing in the morning activity. Number 7, do you gulp your drinks as if to satisfy a great thirst? Yeah, drinks didn't last long. Number 8, did you ever have loss of memory due to your drinking? Absolutely. I'd black out almost every night, and I'd be missing multiple hours of time. There would be evidence in the morning. Maybe things were fixed around the house, or dishes would be done, or the save point in my game would be an hour or two after my last memory. Number 9, did you avoid being honest with others about your drinking? Sure, that was one reason I wanted to drink alone, to keep things secret. Shortly before I got sober, my mother-in-law had a large birthday party. We'd paid for the booze, and we had a ton left over, and it was all boxed up in the garage and in the liquor cabinet because we'd recently moved. And my wife, she didn't really pay attention to my drinking, but eventually she realized that in like a month, most of that alcohol was gone. And we're talking like $700-800 worth of handlebars. And now she tells me that this was when she realized that things were getting out of control. Number 10. Do you ever get in trouble when you're drinking? Yeah, duh. I used to get in fights, get arrested, damage relationships with friends and loved ones. You name it, it happened. Number 11. You often get drunk when you drink, even when you don't mean to. No. And the reason I say no is because I always meant to get drunk. I never tried to drink and not get drunk. There was only one objective: total annihilation. Number 12. Have you ever decided to stop drinking for a week or so, but only lasted for a couple of days? Yeah, we've talked about this. Sometimes I'd last 5 minutes or an hour. Sometimes I make it a few days, 3 days, 4 days. It's ridiculous. That applies to smoking and drinking both. Whenever I'd get high, I would usually start drinking too, once it got to maybe 3 in the afternoon, and then I'd finish the day doing both. Number 13. Do you wish that people would mind their own business about your drinking? Stop telling you what to do. On this one, I would say not really. No one ever told me that. At least no one I took seriously, except for therapists and counselors at the end, and I ended up listening to them. But I think that was because I surrounded myself mostly with people who were on board with my habit, because they had the same or a similar habit. Number 14. Have you ever switched from one kind of drink to another in the hope that this would keep you from getting drunk? No. I mean, if you listen to my response in question number 11, there was always one goal, and that was total annihilation. Number 15. Have you had an eye-opener upon waking up the past year? No. We covered this in one of the previous questions. Like I mentioned before, it was only because weed was how I started my day. I wouldn't start drinking until lunchtime or dinner time. Number 16. Do you envy people who can drink without getting in trouble? Yeah, totally. The damn normies. I wish I could have one or two, but I can't. It's impossible. Like I said, total annihilation is the goal. Number 17. Have you had problems connected with drinking during the last year? Yeah, for the last year before I got sober, those problems were mostly with my relationship with my wife and with my children. I would usually start drinking before they went to sleep, so they weren't usually awake while I was drunk. But my addiction absolutely impacted my ability to cope with emotions like rage and anger, and I didn't have to be drunk to have those problems, or for them to impact my children and my wife. I was also emotionally unavailable for them. Also, with my wife, when I drank, I would isolate. So a healthy couple would spend time together and bond once their children went to sleep. But I was off in my own little world, and our relationship suffered because of it. If you go back farther than a year, there were lots of issues, arrests, fights, etc. Has your drinking caused trouble at home? I just talked about this in my response to question 17. Number 19, you ever try to get extra drinks at a party because you can't get enough? The way I would address this was by bringing my own bottle or cooler. Then it wasn't something I had to worry about. Prior to this, I would just leave if I couldn't drink fast enough to get drunk. I would usually go somewhere where I could be alone so I could do work. Annihilating myself. Do you tell yourself you can stop drinking anytime you want to, even though you keep getting drunk when you don't mean to? No, that wasn't really me, but only because I had tried to get sober so many times and failed miserably. I knew I had to have it. I was aware of this dynamic. Number 21. Have you missed days of work or school because of drinking? No, I decided to do something before things got to that point. However, I'm under no illusion. Things would have gotten to that point eventually had I not decided to get sober when I did. They say that addiction is a progressive illness. It gets worse over time. And for me, this is absolutely true. Do you have blackouts? That's number 22. Yeah, absolutely. I'd miss a couple of hours every night. And to this day, there are stories that people tell me. And I don't remember the situations and the stories they're telling, even though they're about me. But from what they describe, there is no one else on the planet who it could be. It has to be me. There's no chance it was a mistaken case of identity. The behavior they describe was completely consistent when you consider my personality and my worldview. And number 23, have you ever felt like your life would be better if you did not drink? Absolutely. That's why I tried to get clean cold turkey so many times. And that's why I eventually went to rehab. Also, that's why I eventually surrounded myself with like-minded individuals who either wanted what I wanted or already had attained what I wanted. Alright, so I started talking about the mental journey of figuring out and admitting I had a problem. So, coming back on that full circle. Before I was a husband and a father, my principles and values were get fucked up and have fun. Whatever that meant, whatever it entailed, get fucked up and have fun. When I got married and my children arrived, my principles and values started to shift and become clear. And those principles were this. I have something special here. I have a family. I have a wife who loves me and 2 beautiful kids. And now I had to be a good father and a good husband. And I had to be a whole human being and complete to do that. I had to be emotionally and physically healthy to execute on that. So that's why the last few years of addiction was particularly painful emotionally. Because deep down, I knew that it was keeping me from being healthy and being the best human and husband and father that I could be. And when I went in for the assessment, I talked through all of it. And when I talked through it all out loud and heard it in my own voice, it all became clear. The reason I was hurting became clear. And what I had to address and resolve, which was my addiction, became clear. The questions I went through here were the same thing. Reading them and answering them made it so crystal clear that there was a huge issue. And it made the reason for my emotional pain so abundantly obvious. So, I knew my addiction was a problem early on, but I had not hit critical mass yet in terms of pain and motivation. And I wouldn't for a very long time. There were 4 events that led up to the motivation and the pain. 1, I got married to my wife and my children were born. And this event by itself wasn't enough. Number 2, I realized I was isolating from my wife and children because of my addiction and the consequential lack of emotional health. 3, since I was isolating and was emotionally unhealthy, I wasn't the best person I could be, and I wasn't the best father and husband I could be. Number 4, I talked through all of this with psychiatrists and therapists and the intake folks at the IOP clinic to realize how much this hurt me deep down. So that is the long and drawn out way I went about realizing my addiction was a problem worth devoting all of my effort to address. So if we distill it down to a few sentences, here is how you could possibly tell when addiction is a problem. When it keeps you from doing what is important to you, it's a problem. It could be going to work, getting or keeping a job, being a good husband, father, son, daughter, brother, sister, being a good significant other, assuming that you care deeply for the other person, following your dreams, whatever those may be. If the addiction gets between you and something you care about or value, it is going to cause you pain, and that's a problem. Another qualifier is that if your addiction leads you to suffering consequences, and you know there are consequences that you will suffer, quite severe ones, but you can do nothing about it, that's a huge indicator that it's a problem, right? You know the flame is hot, but you keep going back to the stove and burning yourself over and over again. That's a good indicator that it may be a problem. So pro-sobriety, these questions spoke to my soul. They were a dead ringer for that internal conflict where I was trying to figure out if I had a problem, trying to convince myself, and if I did have a problem, figure out how severe it was. And I can't help but wonder, if I'd been walking on the street before I considered getting clean seriously when I was still using, what if I found a piece of paper with these questions on it? And I took a minute to actually read through those questions and honestly answer them. Would it have made a difference? Would I have been able to pursue sobriety earlier? I don't deserve to be in pain. You don't deserve to be in pain. There's more to life than that. So go get what's important to you, and don't let anything stand in your way. Alright, so that wraps it up. Hopefully this helps those of you struggling to answer the question, is this a problem? Do I have issues with substance abuse? If you found this helpful, share it with others. If you're listening via iTunes, please scroll down to the ratings and review section and leave me a rating and a review. YouTube, like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. If you have thoughts, comments, or feedback for me, I can be reached via email at selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening. Good luck on your journey. Louis out.